Hello there everybody, and welcome to what I'm hoping is the final analysis video on the beta versions of Last Line of Defense and Countdown for the Transformers TCG. Anthony joining you once again, as I just implied, we're going to be talking about the Last Line of Defense and Countdown from the Bayformers World Strike beta. I should also mention that I just uploaded a massive video of me and John testing these cards against various decks alongside this video, so if you haven't watched that yet, I'd recommend you go and watch at least a couple parts of that video to get some context on where I'm forming my analysis from. Albeit, I'll warn you that video is ridiculously long, so don't feel obligated to watch everything. Just pick and choose what you want to see if you so desire. But with the disclaimers out of the way, let's start by talking about what I've noticed in comparison to the analysis I gave in the last video I did on this subject, during which I claimed Last Line of Defense is broken. I'll get this out of the way now. I have since withdrawn that opinion, and I instead now hold the opinion that Omega Supreme will become a meta equalizer in formats that allow Bayformers cards. What I mean by this is, through my testing, I noticed conventional offensive and defensive strategies, such as my Dinobot and my Battle Charger deck, struggle to break through Omega's defenses, but the unconventional methods like Cosmos were able to break him with no issue. And the kicker is, these unconventional strategies have a tendency, in my experience, to lose to conventional strategies fairly often unless that unconventional strategy's name is horrible. What this means is that Omega Supreme will keep those conventional strategies in check. The unconventional strategies will have room to flourish because they'll be able to take down the Equalizer and some other various decks, and there will be a greater mix of strategies overall in the meta. At least that's the theory. Once I realized that was a trend, I realized the issues I was actually complaining about previously, as it turns out, are not really that much of an issue if you're playing the right cards. However, while this is a fair point to bring up, because every deck should have both good and bad matchups, I still feel the combination of Omega Supreme, Last Line, and Countdown has a couple of issues, albeit you're free to disagree with me on that, because my opinion is not and should not be considered the end-all and be-all when it comes to this. And if you do disagree with me on anything, let me know why down in the comments, as long as you do so respectfully. Okay, so basically there are two changes that I think should be made. One I'm confident on, the other not so much. The first change, and this is the one I'm not as confident on, is dropping the health boost from Last Line by 1 or 2 points. Now, something I noticed in a few of these matches before we started filming, and for a couple that we did film, those decks were getting Omega Supreme to 26 damage with some difficulty, but not too little difficulty to make Omega easy to kill. However, those same decks could not get him to 28. Now, this may have been a result of those decks having a lack of direct damage as a finisher, but one of the decks that fell because of that reason was Fort Max, and he had his effect, Sturdy Javelin, Marksmanship, squish them like bugs, and Precision Fire on hand as finishers, yet he could only finish Omega Supreme off once in a 3-game set. So I'm inclined to slightly disagree with that potential issue with the testing. Here's the thing though, Omega Supreme needs that health boost to be viable, so I'd say you keep a health boost on Last Line of Defense, but reduce it to either a +3 or a +2 bonus. However, I'm not too sure if that would be needed necessarily, so that's something I'm really open to discussion about. What I'm less open to discussion about, but still am to an extent, is Countdown's alt mode effect, which I have on screen right now if you don't know what that does. I previously thought this wasn't an issue, but after playing all these matches post Last Line of Defense fix, giving Omega Supreme a second utility slot instead of a second armor slot, I've noticed that Countdown provides a bit too much damage versatility, and it allows you to either spread damage in a manner previously not possible, or focus fire a character you really shouldn't be able to focus down as often as Countdown allows, and both of these really don't seem to be affected by the once per turn clause he has. Now, there's a few examples of this happening in the files, but the one that comes to mind is particularly ridiculous is when John managed to use Countdown to spread damage between Perceptor and both pieces of Sky Shadow to KO them all at once using Last Line's damage effect. Say that 5 times fast. And that's something that just seems a bit too powerful. As for the fix, it's something I think got mentioned on Discord at one point, but don't quote me on that. Having the effect move damage onto the attacker instead of any enemy. Not only would this help prevent crazy combo KO setups like I mentioned earlier, which was fairly easy for John to set up, might I add, but it also creates a better skill dynamic on both sides of the field. Omega has to choose their targets carefully based on who Countdown moves damage onto, and the opponent needs to be careful as to who might take that damage that Countdown does when their deck is in all-out mode against Omega Supreme. So those are the changes I think need to be made, but regardless of whether that happens or not, Omega Supreme is still a fairly tough deck to punch through, so we need to figure out some counters. At this point, I've gone through all the cards from all 5 official sets, as well as Arc 1, Alpha Trion 1, and World Strike to find anything to help mitigate Omega Supreme's strengths, which are great defense and counter damage via Countdown. But I am bound to miss some possible options, so if I miss something you think would work, or if I mention something you think doesn't work, let me know down in the comments. First up are 2 of the best characters for dealing with Countdown, both coming out of World Strike, Power Glide and Crash Bash. Now, I have more experience with Power Glide, so we'll talk about him first. As I'm recording this, all of Power Glide's modes were either just changed completely or have just been reworded to clear up rule links, but thankfully none of them were changed in a way that would have impacted the files. As to what makes Power Glide, I'm getting my terms mixed up here, what makes Power Glide a hard counter to Countdown is his bot mode skill, which as of November 17th reads, when your opponent moves at least 1 damage counter onto one of your characters, instead they move the damage counters onto this, then repair 1 damage from this. This means that if you have Power Glide in bot mode, if Countdown's effect triggers, that single damage that gets thrown back at you automatically moves on to Power Glide, and then he just heals it off. And on his own, Power Glide is a great counter, but if you really want to hammer it home, you also use Thermal Reciprocation, a 3-star stratagem that reads, and give me a second to pull it up here since I am absolutely horrible at managing things. When your opponent moves at least 1 damage counter onto your Autobot Power Glide, or he takes damage from the opponent's cards, place a separate counter on this. When your character upgraded with your S2 Thermal Reciprocator, Power Glide's weapon mode, does attack damage to an enemy, remove a counter from this to do 1 damage to the enemy. And if that wasn't enough, you also get a +1 attack boost, which applies to his weapon mode, in addition to his bot and alt modes, and a +5 health boost. What this means is anytime Countdown's effect triggers, you get a counter on Thermal Reciprocation. Anytime last line of defense's damage effect is triggered, you get a counter. And if any sort of direct damage is thrown on Power Glide, you get a counter, but you only get 1 overall, not 1 for each point of damage you took. Despite that, the counters actually rack up fairly quickly against Omega Supreme, and should Power Glide get KO'd, which didn't happen too often in my testing, in fact I don't think it happened at all, you then have another method of bypassing Omega's defenses and flinging damage back into him without consequence. Of course, this isn't moving damage, so Hollow Matter Projector could be a problem, but I'll leave that to you to figure out. What Hollow Matter Projector doesn't stop is Crash Bash, and we're only focusing on the bot mode here, which reads, and give me a second to pull it up because I suck at managing things, when this would do attack damage to an enemy and you flip at least 1 orange and 1 blue, you may move the damage onto another enemy instead. Basically, what this means is if you manage to damage Omega Supreme on an attack with Crash Bash, you can then move the damage to Countdown if you flip orange-blue, effectively bypassing the Brave on Omega Supreme, and the Stealth while untapped on Countdown in certain situations. Now, the problem here is you actually have to deal damage through whatever Omega is flipping, but with enough fusion bores, that shouldn't be a problem. As for a head choice, since Crash Bash is a body character, there are a few options that you could use in terms of countering Omega Supreme, and I'll speed through them quickly. Teslor for focus to help get the effect going, Locos for plan to help getting the effect going, and that's a head that's included in World Strike, Mind Control Collar, another World Strike head, for either bold, pierce, or focus, depending on what you need to get damage on the Countdown, Ominous to actually help get damage through onto Omega's defense, or through Omega's defenses thanks to having Pierce 4, or Parsec, Flameout, or Clobber for bold if that's the route you want to take to trigger his effect. At this point, I'll also mention that Horrible is a decent counter for Countdown, but I'm just going to leave it at that due to the fact that I am not the person to vouch for that card, considering I had this to say about him when Wave 5 got released. What the f*** is this abomination of a card? And for those of you asking why I said that, I don't even remember at this point. But back to Omega Supreme. In terms of bashing through his defenses, probably the premier option for this is RC, who needs no introduction. You get an attack boost of at least 3 or 4 on her, you're getting a decent amount of damage through, albeit she isn't the best defender, so that's something you'll want to be careful about. And with only 9 health, she's a bit more vulnerable to Countdown, but playing Power Glide with her could put a stop to that fairly quick. On a similar note to our C is Megatron Decepticon Leader, specifically if you get a fusion cannon on him with some other kind of attack boost, because then you're hitting for pure 6, and if Countdown's alive, that's still 5 damage going into Omega. On top of that, since Megatron is a tank, you have access to the Hunker Down Superior Plating combo to help prevent Omega from getting to swing back into you, and that's been made even easier due to the Arc version of such heroic nonsense, which allows you to pick up a Hunker Down as though it had a green icon. Also, if you end up going the Megatron route, maybe pair him with Warpath for Tough to Know? If you don't want to go with Megatron, though, there's actually a similar option available with Nova Storm as long as you have a black icon upgrade on her, albeit she doesn't have the Hunker Down option that Megatron does. However, she does have access to Bombing Run, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. Now, it's important to note that those options rely on actually dealing attack damage to punch through, whereas these next two options rely on other methods to get rid of Omega, Shockwave and Cosmos. Now, Shockwave is probably the less reliable of the two because he relies on a combination of System Reboot and Calibers to get through. However, should you get that off, that's a minimum of 4 damage to Omega Supreme. There's no way they're putting that damage on the Countdown, so that's why it's Omega. But that number can vary depending on how many cards they scrap off the System Reboot, and that number can be slightly modified either with Unconventional Flying Object, Showing Off, or Disarm in order to increase Omega's hand size, then either dropping a System Reboot via Brainstorm or Leap of Faith, or using Fix-It's Tap skill in order to flip Shockwave to bot mode to actually get the damage in the event you had to use UFO to get his alt mode skill going. Admittedly, this isn't the most reliable option, but it is an option. As for Cosmos, this guy absolutely chews through Omega. You have to know how to effectively run him to get him working, but with Orbital Strike being a thing, there's absolutely no chance for survival for Omega if you know how to make Countdown work. And an option to help that is Captain Wheeljack, not only for the extra draw for playing multiple actions, but the Brainstorm right off the bat is a huge piece to have. And one extra note, while the Shockwave deck faltered to an extent, Cosmos prevailed every time I tried to run him up against Omega, and I was originally going to include a Cosmos match in the files, but the match ended up being extremely boring, so I ended up cutting it. So I'm going to warn you that Cosmos could be a very boring deck to play against because of that, albeit considering how powerful Omega can be, I wouldn't really consider that an issue. Now, this guy really doesn't fit into any of the other categories I've mentioned, that being Arc Galvatron. And the reason I say that is because he does rely on direct damage, but he deals 4 and he kind of relies on attacking in order to do it, so he falls into a weird limbo state. But if you can get his effect off by putting Particle Cannon and some other white icon upgrade on him, and then flipping orange-black, you might be able to actually, deal 4 damage to Countdown, and then you could use something like Magnetic Dysfunction Array, more on that later, to finish him off. So that's a potential option as well. Admittedly, I should mention all those solutions assume Omega Supreme still has Brave, even Galvatron to an extent, but there are a trio of cards that just flat out ignore Brave. Battlefield Scan, Dazzle Strike, and Brawl. Now, Battlefield Scan is likely the easiest to make use of since it's a premier example of a sideboard card, albeit Omega Supreme is the only deck I can think of that constantly makes use of Brave, so take that into consideration before you throw this into your sideboard. As for Dazzle Strike and Brawl, I only bring up Dazzle Strike simply because he can ignore Brave, but I recommend if you're trying to decide between him and Brawl, go with Brawl. Not only is Brawl one less star, he also shuts down stealth, does damage to enemies with armor, which Omega is likely to have, and is a decent defender in alt mode. On top of that, should you play Brawl, a great partner for him would be Unicron Raid Galvatron, whose alt mode skill in combination with Brawl's bot mode should just absolutely melt through Countdown, albeit that's just an idea I've had for the sake of this video. I haven't tested it, so take that with a grain of salt. Now, since we just discussed Battlefield Scan, let's actually move over to some battle cards that help to beat Omega, starting with 2 cards I mentioned that we'll get back to. First, Magnetic Dysfunction Array. If you're playing a team with no Autobots, or a plane team, more on that in a moment, then you only take 1 damage on each of your characters, while Omega gets chipped down a bit more, and Countdown loses 1/3 of his health. On top of that, there is the combo I mentioned earlier with Galvatron, where you could drop one of these, then get his ability off and KO Countdown in 1 turn. As for Bombing Run, this only works if you're playing a plane team, but should you do that, that's 3 or 4 damage going on to Countdown depending on how many planes you're using, and that's generally going to be 3, but possibly 4 if you run like Airstrike Patrol members alongside Windsweeper. I'll actually take this moment to mention that the only team that managed to beat Omega in the files was a plane deck that used Slipstream, Windsweeper, and Power Glide. So there's a full team that can beat Omega for sure. And not only was it using Bombing Run, but it also had Caving Crash and Sturdy Javelin on hand. Both do 2 damage while still having icons, which makes them better than Plasma Burst as a method to damage Countdown. However, Javelin only works on ranged characters and Crash makes you take a damage, so that's something to keep in mind, albeit neither of those really matter for plane decks that use Slipstream and or Windsweeper, and the latter really doesn't matter if you're using Horrible. Now, besides those options, there are a few others, but since this video is almost at 15 minutes long, I'll do a quick speed round through these. Energon Mace gives you a finisher option for when Omega gets KO'd before Countdown, or as an option to help kill Countdown if you're using Unicron Raid, Galvatron, and Brawl. Backfire could be handy if Omega has upgrades galore dumped onto him, like extra padding. Disarm helps clear Omega Supreme of any of those defensive boosts he might have from stuff like extra padding. Vandalize helps get rid of them even longer if you can take the star card. Cacophonous Failure out of Arc helps prevent Omega from setting secret actions like Hidden Fortification or Heroic Resolve. Belligerents can basically disable Omega Slips for a turn. Bigger they are and heavy-handed for some large Pierce values, depending on how much your characters cost, albeit since Omega is 19, it's most likely going to be bigger they are. Thermal Weaponry for extra Pierce if you're playing a blue deck. Bumpers to shut down Countdown completely, but only if you're playing a card deck. Stunticon Swagger to shut down Tough for Menasor, albeit there is some Menasor support apparently coming in Alpha Trion Protocols 2, so that might actually be a decent option now. And W5 Gyro Blaster if your characters have a high attack value and you're playing an orange deck. Of course, that's not every option to help beat Omega, and there are likely more to come out across all future fan sets, but that's everything I can think of as of the day this is getting uploaded. Now, again, like I said earlier, if I missed something or you disagree with me on something, let me know down in the comments, since I'm bound to either miss something or be wrong about something. Just take a look at my hot takes on Horrible and Perceptor if you want an example of that. With that being said, hopefully I never have to talk about Countdown and Last Line of Defense again outside of the eventual every card in 9 words or less video for World Strike. So with that all out of the way, hopefully you enjoyed this analysis on those cards and my analysis on what could potentially stop them from becoming dominant. And hopefully you enjoyed the Omega Supreme files. That was an absolute marathon to put together, but I think it was definitely worth it in the end to show basically what our thought process was for taking this thing down. And that it took a lot of effort, but again, I think it was worth it. And if you did enjoy this or the files, maybe subscribe. I don't know. Again, I hate asking people to do that, but I will do it every once in a while to help keep the channel growing. So you're gonna have to forgive me for that if you already are subscribed. So you can just ignore it at this point. And I'm gonna shut up now before I go on a rant because this video has already gone on long enough. So again, hopefully you enjoyed what you saw here and in the Omega Supreme files, and that will do it for this video. Peace out, y'all.